History books will tell you about the great estates of England in the 1840s, the dukes who expanded them, the marriages that secured them, and the laws that protected them. But history has a habit of leaving out the inconvenient parts. It will not tell you about the afternoon at Watson Estate when a duke raised his finger at a woman and laughed, and how that single moment of cruelty unraveled everything he believed about power, about worth, and about himself. It will not tell you about the woman who was standing in that courtyard, holding a small flintlock pistol steady in both hands, her green dress catching the last gold of the evening sun, her face as calm as still water. It will not tell you that she had already decided. Not to cry, not to run, to win. Her name was Eva O'Donnell. And if you judged her by what society saw, a fuller woman, unmarried at 27, with no title of her own, no suitors, and no particular beauty by the narrow standards of the English aristocracy, you would make the same mistake George Watson made. You would laugh, and you would regret it for the rest of your life. This is not a fairy tale. It is not a romance story dressed in silk and lies. It is the account of a woman who was publicly humiliated, offered a duke, and said no, and what she built with her hands, her mind, and her refusal to be less than she was. The courtyard of Watson Estate sat at the edge of a wide gravel drive lined with carriages, their horses breathing steam in the cooling autumn air. Guests had gathered, not casually, the way people gather at a picnic, but with the stiff, the deliberate posture of those who know they are being watched and wish to appear as if they are not watching. Gentlemen in dark tailcoats and high white cravats, ladies in wide skirts and careful expressions. A string quartet had stopped playing minutes earlier. Nobody had asked them to stop. They simply felt the shift in the air, that particular electricity that gathers before something unforgivable is said out loud. Eva stood near the center of the courtyard. She was not there by accident. She had been invited by her aunt, the Duchess Margaret O'Donnell, born Lady Margaret Ashby, royal blood in her veins, and 40 years of aristocratic composure in her spine. The Duchess had married into the O'Donnell name and carried it like a crown. Her niece, Eva, carried it quietly. Too quietly, people said. That was the trouble with Eva O'Donnell. She did not push herself forward. She did not perform the light, careful laughter that debutantes practiced in front of mirrors. She did not flutter. She read estate ledgers. She studied trade law in her aunt's library when the house was asleep. She could calculate compound interest faster than most solicitors. She could outshoot most country gentlemen at 60 yards, but she could not be thin. And in this world, that was treated as the more serious crime. Duke George Watson was not a bad man by birth. That is perhaps the saddest thing about him. He had been given everything: the height, the jaw, the dark curling hair, the navy tailcoat cut to perfection, and the gold brocade waistcoat beneath it that caught light the way only very expensive things do. He had been given the estate and the title at 22, or when his father died of a winter fever. He had been given admiration so early and so easily that he had never once considered what it cost other people when he was careless with it. He was laughing now. He stood near the stone steps of the estate entrance, surrounded by the usual circle. Alexander Rahman close at his right shoulder, as always, thin and sharp-jawed, wearing the practiced smile of a man who thrives on other people's discomfort. Charlie Burrows, young and impressionable, stood a little behind, wanting to belong to that circle badly enough to mirror everything in it, including its cruelty. George had said something low, angled at Eva, and Alexander had leaned in and repeated it, and the laughter had spread outward through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Eva heard it. She had been looking down at the small pistol in her hands. It had been brought out as part of an afternoon shooting demonstration organized by Colonel Thomas Paine, who stood now at the far edge of the courtyard with Oliver Fisher, both men watching the scene with the uncomfortable stillness of people who know something is going wrong and are not yet sure what they should do about it. Eva heard the laughter, and she looked up. George Watson was pointing at her. "No suitor wanted her then," he said, loudly enough for the assembled guests to hear every syllable. "None will want her now." The crowd did not erupt. It tittered, which is somehow worse. A quiet, sideways sound. Ladies behind fans. Men glancing away to signal they had found it funny while maintaining the appearance of restraint. Eva did not cry. She did not look away. She placed one hand more firmly around the grip of the pistol, raised her chin a precise half-inch, and said, quietly, but in the silence it carried across the entire courtyard, "Then perhaps the Duke would care to make it interesting. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to us. It is really essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. All right? Thank you. Now let's get back to the story. To understand Eva O'Donnell, you have to go back further than the courtyard. You have to go back to the morning her father died, when she was 9 years old, and her mother sat her down in the parlour of their modest country house and said, with the flat, exhausted honesty of a woman who has cried all she had, "We will go to your aunt now, and you will be grateful, Eva, and quiet, and small." She had tried. For years she had tried the smallness. Duchess Margaret O'Donnell's estate was called Briar Hall. It sat 11 miles from Watson Estate, separated by rolling farmland and an old stone wall that had been there longer than either family. Briar Hall was not the largest estate in the county, but it was precise, the way things are when someone intelligent and proud has managed them for a long time. The gardens were deliberate. The books in the library were read, not displayed. The household accounts were current to the week, not the quarter. Yet the Duchess had been born Lady Margaret Ashby, fourth daughter of the Earl of Carron, and she had married Richard O'Donnell, a man of Irish descent, with more charm than title, because she had wanted to. Her family had disapproved. She had not cared. She had outlived Richard by 14 years and managed Briar Hall alone, and whatever anyone thought of an aristocratic widow who refused to remarry, no one said it to her face. Eva had grown up in that house. She had absorbed its precision the way a plant absorbs light, steadily, without asking permission. She had read every book in the library before she was 19. She had learned the estate ledgers because her aunt showed her, and because she found numbers honest in a way that people rarely were. But Briar Hall was also the place where Eva learned what the world thought of her body, as it started with the dance masters, the way they avoided partnering her in demonstrations, the way seamstresses sighed before measuring her, the way suitors, when they came calling at her aunt's encouragement, smiled politely at the Duchess and let their eyes glide past Eva, as if she were a piece of furniture they had already decided did not suit the room. 3 suitors in her first formal season. All 3 had withdrawn their interest within a fortnight, their reasons varying in politeness, but identical in substance. Eva had not wept about it. That surprised people. Her composure in the face of rejection was misread as numbness, as resignation. It was neither. It was the decision of a woman who had realized, early, that if the world was going to assign her a certain value regardless of what she did, she would at least make herself genuinely valuable, not for anyone else's comfort, for her own. She studied trade law because Jonathan Bray, her aunt's family solicitor, a lean, steady man of about 50, with grey at his temples and the habit of speaking in complete sentences, had once answered her questions about estate inheritance for an entire afternoon, without once seeming to find them strange. She had asked to borrow his legal texts, and he had brought 3 more the following week without being asked again. She studied marksmanship because Mabel, the Duchess's old, blunt-spoken housekeeper, who had been at Briar Hall since before Eva was born, had taught her. Mabel was in her 60s, broad-shouldered and entirely without ceremony. And she had grown up on a farm before going into service, and she could hit a fence post at 40 yards with either hand. She saw Eva watching once from the kitchen garden and said simply, "You want to learn? Or just watch?" Eva had said she wanted to learn. That had been 8 years ago. She was, by the autumn of 1847, a better shot than most men who would not acknowledge that fact. She also knew, because Jonathan had carefully prepared a document for the Duchess the previous spring, that Watson Estate was in financial trouble. Not ruin. Not yet. But the new textile trading routes had made the Duke's old land-based income unreliable. His manager, a man named Lucas, had tried to restructure the estate's output, but Lucas was loyal and hard-working, and not particularly strategic. But the estate needed someone who understood trade law and modern commerce. The Duchess had quietly positioned Eva to observe this situation, for reasons she had not fully explained to Eva yet. Eva was still thinking about Jonathan's document, about the gap between the estate's visible grandeur and its quiet financial bleeding, when she arrived at Watson Estate that October afternoon, and the carriages pulled up and the guests began to fill the courtyard. She had not come looking for a fight. She had not been looking for anything except the afternoon's shooting demonstration, which Colonel Thomas Paine had organized as a point of social entertainment. Paine being a retired military officer with a precisely trimmed grey moustache and the bearing of a man who still believed that a properly run event reflected the character of civilization. Yet Oliver Fisher had come with him, a quieter man, broader through the shoulders, who had served with Paine and shared his belief in fairness, order, and the correct loading of a pistol. Eva had come because she was good at this, and because her aunt had told her to attend with her chin up and her gloves clean. She had not come to be pointed at by a duke in front of his admirers. But here she was. George Watson had not planned to say it. That was the strange and uncomfortable truth about cruelty of this particular kind. It rarely came with a plan. It came with comfort, with the ease of a man who had never once in his 31 years been told that his words could leave a mark. He had been talking to Alexander Rahman and Charlie Burrows about the afternoon's shooting arrangement, neither of them particularly interested. Was both of them nodding along when he had spotted Eva across the courtyard. She had been standing near Colonel Payne's equipment table, examining one of the demonstration pistols. Her green dress was clean and simple. Her dark hair was pinned neatly at the back of her head. She stood with the quiet concentration of someone doing a task they take seriously. Alexander had said something under his breath, sharp, dismissive, and George had laughed before he thought about it. And then, because Alexander was watching him for confirmation, and Charlie was watching Alexander for permission, and the moment was there like a door left open, George had pointed and spoken, loud enough for the crowd to hear. No suitor wanted her then. None will want her now. He had watched Eva look up. He had expected tears, or the quick retreat, the ducked head, or the hurried movement toward the back of the crowd, the familiar pattern he had observed in women who had been embarrassed in public and did not know how to do anything but disappear. Eva did neither. She raised her chin and said, "Then perhaps the Duke would care to make it interesting." The courtyard went very still. George blinked. The laughter had not quite died yet. It hovered, uncertain, waiting to see which direction the wind was blowing. "Interesting?" he said. He was not, by nature, quick to back down from an audience. "A wager," Eva said. She held the pistol loosely, professionally, in a way that Colonel Payne, who had turned sharply at the word wager, noticed immediately. "You believe I am without worth or skill. I suggest we test that belief in the only honest language this assembly understands. Shooting. 60 yards. The better marksman wins." Alexander Rahman exhaled a small laugh through his nose. A private, proprietary sound, the kind a man makes when he is managing something he wants to control. "A lady shooting," Alexander said to George, loudly enough to perform for the crowd. "Your Grace, surely this is beneath a formal response?" Charlie Burrows laughed, slightly too loud, the way young men laugh when they are trying to demonstrate that they belong to the right side of a room. George looked at Eva for a long moment. He was not afraid. That would come later, and he would not name it correctly when it did. Right now he felt the particular irritation of a man whose comfortable moment has been disrupted by someone who was not supposed to have a voice in it. "And what," he said, "are the terms?" "If I win," Eva said, "you will formally acknowledge, before these witnesses, that your mockery was without foundation. Publicly, completely. And if I win," George said, "you may say whatever you like about me, or you will have earned it." George Watson looked out at the crowd, at the assembled faces, some shocked, some delighted, some carefully blank in the way of people who are watching history and trying to decide how to feel about it. He looked at Colonel Payne, who met his gaze steadily and said nothing. He looked at Oliver Fisher, who folded his arms and also said nothing. He looked back at Eva. "Done," he said. He said it the way men say things they think are easy. Alexander Rahman stepped closer to George's shoulder and lowered his voice just enough that only George and the nearest guests could hear. "This is ridiculous. She'll embarrass herself and you'll be done with it by supper." George nodded slightly. He did not know, at that moment, that he was stepping off the edge of the life he had always assumed was permanent. Or Colonel Thomas Payne moved with purpose. He was the sort of man who, when given an event to oversee, treated it as a matter of honor, regardless of the circumstances that had produced it. He gestured to Oliver Fisher, who was already setting up the range markers without being asked, 60 yards, measured properly, with the calm efficiency of a man who has done this 10,000 times under considerably more stressful conditions. The crowd reorganized itself instinctively, the way crowds do when something has shifted from social occasion to genuine event. Ladies moved to better vantage points. Gentlemen who had been holding conversations about horses and harvests abandoned them entirely. Zara Parsons, a sharp, bright-eyed woman of Eva's age who had been her closest companion at Briar Hall for 3 years, stood near the edge of the assembled guests and watched Eva walk to the firing line with an expression that held equal parts fear and fierce, quiet pride. Olivia Arnold, who had come with the Parson household and who was the kind of woman who collected other people's social disasters for private satisfaction, stood beside Zara with her fan raised and her eyes very wide. "She's going to shoot," Olivia said, as though reporting a fire. "Yes," Zara said. "She is." Jennifer, the Duchess's young maid who had accompanied them to the estate, clasped her hands together near the rear of the crowd and pressed her lips tight. She had seen Eva practice at Briar Hall. She was not worried about Eva's ability. She was worried about what winning would cost her. Colonel Payne addressed the assembled gathering. "This demonstration will proceed under the standards of a formal marksmanship trial," he said. 3 shots each, stationary target at 60 yards. The competitor with the closest aggregate grouping to center is declared the winner. The terms of the wager have been stated and acknowledged before witnesses. If either party disputes the result, it will be adjudicated by myself and Mr. Fisher on the evidence of the targets. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not what anyone had expected from the afternoon. George Watson stood at his position. He was, in fact, a capable shot, above average for a country gentleman. He had been shooting since he was 12. He had hunted across 5 counties. He settled into his stance with easy confidence, checked the pistol Payne had handed him, and looked down range at the white target card. Eva stood at her position. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at George Watson. She looked at the target. She breathed once, slowly, all the way out. She thought of Mabel in the kitchen garden in the early morning, the light still low and grey, saying, "Stop trying to hit it. Know where it already is." Colonel Payne raised his flag. "On my signal." The flag dropped. George shot first. It was a good shot, solid, slightly left of center. The crowd approved with a quiet sound. Alexander Rahman's chin lifted with satisfaction. Eva raised her pistol. She did not rush. She did not perform steadiness. She was simply steady, or in the way of someone who has no gap between themselves and what they are doing. She fired. The target was examined. Her shot was fractionally closer to center than his. The crowd was silent. George's expression did not change. He reloaded. Eva reloaded. Second round, George adjusted and fired. This time his shot was clean, center adjacent, a respectable mark. Charlie Burrows let out a small sound of encouragement. Eva fired her second shot. Dead center. The silence from the crowd shifted quality. It was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of something being understood. George Watson stared down range at the target. His jaw was set. Something was moving behind his eyes that was not yet fully formed. Not quite anger. Not quite recognition. Just a disturbance. Like water that has not yet decided which direction to run. He loaded for the third shot. He fired. Good. Center right. Another respectable mark. Eva loaded her third shot. She paused for only a second, not from nerves, but from the same instinct that made her double-check legal documents before signing. Making certain, not performing certainty, having it. She fired. Oliver Fisher walked to the target, examined it, and walked back. He spoke quietly to Colonel Payne. Colonel Payne turned to face the assembled crowd. "The result stands as follows," he said, in the voice of a man who has delivered verdicts before and does not embellish them. "Miss Eva O'Donnell holds the superior aggregate grouping by a margin that is not in dispute. The wager is decided." There is a kind of silence that is louder than noise. It settled over the courtyard of Watson Estate like a weather change. Sudden, total, and impossible to ignore. The ladies who had been holding their fans to their mouths lowered them. The gentlemen who had been making small private bets among themselves stopped speaking mid-sentence. Charlie Burrows looked at Alexander Rahman. Alexander's expression had not moved, but there was something tight around the corners of it. A controlled recalculation happening behind a surface. He was working very hard to keep still. Eva turned from the firing line and walked back toward the center of the courtyard. She was not triumphant in any theatrical sense. She did not smile broadly or raise her chin in victory. She simply walked with the same composure she had brought to the firing line. The composure of a woman who didn't need the room's permission to know what she had done. George Watson had not moved. He stood at his position with the discharged pistol still in his hand, looking at Oliver Fisher's retreating back, as though the verdict might reverse itself if he kept watching the space it had come from. It did not reverse itself. He turned, slowly, to face the crowd. What he saw was something he had never seen directed at him in his life, not mockery, not contempt, but the specific look of an assembly that has just watched a man be genuinely, publicly, undeniably wrong about something he had announced with confidence. It was the look of a room that does not know what to do with that information yet. They were waiting for him. He walked across the courtyard toward Eva. The crowd parted slightly, the way crowds do when they sense that whatever is about to happen will be more interesting if they can see it clearly. George Watson stopped 3 feet from Eva O'Donnell and looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. She met his gaze without effort. She had dark eyes, clear, very direct, and they held none of the apology that years of social rejection had tried to teach them. "The result is what it is," George said. His voice was controlled. Whatever feeling was moving under the surface of it, he had the pride to keep it contained. "It is," Eva agreed. A pause. George nodded, once. "Then I owe you a formal acknowledgement." He turned to face the crowd, not performing, not making a show of it, but meeting the obligation squarely, at which told Eva something about him she filed away carefully. "Miss O'Donnell has won the demonstration by skill and composure," he said. "My earlier remark was made without basis. It was without grace. And it was wrong." The words cost him. She could see that. She did not enjoy that it cost him. She was not built for other people's pain, even the pain of someone who had just publicly humiliated her. But she noted it. He did not minimize the acknowledgement. He did not wrap it in a joke or soften it into something the crowd could laugh with. He said it plainly. And then, because George Watson was, in his deepest habits, a man who processed the world through the social structures he had been raised inside, and because in those structures there was only one offer a duke made to a woman he had publicly wronged, he said, "It is also within the terms of honor that I offer, as consequence of this wager, a formal proposal of marriage." The crowd made a sound. It was a collective, involuntary intake of breath, the kind of sound that comes when a room collectively registers that the story it thought it was watching has just become an entirely different story. Zara Parsons pressed her knuckles to her mouth. Jennifer, at the back of the crowd, covered her eyes with both hands and then immediately uncovered them because she could not stand not to see. Olivia Arnold leaned to the woman beside her and whispered something rapid and delighted. Alexander Rahman's expression shifted into something that looked like satisfaction. A smooth, more settling satisfaction, the kind that comes from a conclusion that feels like an escape. Charlie Burrows had his mouth open. Eva O'Donnell stood very still. She looked at George Watson, at the proposal still hanging between them in the October air, formal and expected and correct by every rule of the society they were standing inside. She breathed slowly, and then she said no. The word was soft. It was not performed. It was not angry or triumphant or emotional. It was simply the truth, stated plainly, the way Eva O'Donnell stated most truths. No. If the first silence, after the wager result, had been loud, this one was enormous. It pressed against every person standing in that courtyard, with the weight of something that had never happened before. A woman refusing a duke. A woman who had just won the right to refuse a duke. But a woman doing it in public, in front of witnesses, with a discharged pistol still warm from proving her point. George Watson looked at her. He was not, in this moment, angry. He was profoundly confused. The confusion of a man whose understanding of how the world works has just been handed back to him with a polite note attached, explaining that it was incorrect. "No," he said. "No," Eva said again. And then, because she was not cruel, and because she had thought about this, had thought, in the 3 weeks since Jonathan had shown her the estate documents, about exactly what this moment might need to be, she continued. "Marriage is not what I want from you, Your Grace. And I suspect, if you are at all honest with yourself, it is not what you want to give." "Then what do you want?" George said. His voice had an edge now. Not fury, but the particular friction of a man standing on ground that is shifting under him. Eva stood straight. Her hands were steady at her sides. When she spoke next, she spoke clearly and without hurry, so that every person in that courtyard could hear exactly what she said. "I want formal recognition, before these witnesses and your legal representative, of a business partnership arrangement. I want access to Watson Estate's commercial trading rights, specifically the textile routing contracts currently under negotiation. I want a documented division giving me authority over exactly half of the estate's commercial operations for a period of 5 years, with results assessed at the term's end." The silence that followed this was different from all the silences before it. It was the silence of an assembly that had come expecting a minor social spectacle and was now watching something they did not have a category for. Alexander Rahman stepped forward from the side. "This is absurd," he said. His voice was sharp, aimed at breaking the strange spell of the moment. "A woman does not negotiate trading rights. This is not—" "Mr. Rahman." Colonel Payne's voice cut across his with military precision. "The terms of a wager conducted before witnesses are binding under the codes of honor this assembly operates by. Unless the Duke wishes to formally refuse." Every eye in the courtyard went to George Watson. He stood with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and he looked at Eva O'Donnell, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she had arrived at his estate, and something passed behind his eyes that was not yet understanding, but was the beginning of the question that would eventually lead there. "Get Jonathan Bray here," he said to the man nearest him. The news left Watson Estate on the tongues of every guest before the carriages had finished loading. By the following morning, it had reached the drawing rooms of every notable household within 20 miles. By evening of that same day, it was in London, carried by letter, by the rapid social post that aristocratic networks have always maintained, by the particular delight people take in passing along information that breaks expected patterns. A woman had beaten the Duke of Watson at his own shooting demonstration. He had offered her marriage, the formal, socially expected consequence. She had refused him, and she had asked for half his commercial estate instead. The reactions were precisely what you would expect from a society that had never had to make room for this particular kind of story. The ladies who had stood behind their fans in that courtyard divided sharply. Half of them found the whole affair scandalous and deeply improper, a woman stepping so far outside the expected form that the form itself felt endangered. The other half, in the privacy of their own parlors and bedrooms, away from the husbands and fathers whose opinions shaped their daily lives, felt something much harder to name. A peculiar, deep-seated satisfaction, like watching a window opened in a room that has been shut too long. The gentlemen were more uniformly disturbed, not because they found Eva wrong exactly, but because she had exposed a logic that most of them relied on without examining it. The logic that a woman's worth was a matter of appearance and availability. It was one thing to believe this privately. It was another to have it publicly tested and found hollow. Alexander Rahman was the most disturbed of all, for reasons that had nothing to do with the shooting. He had spent the night at Watson Estate. He often did, being a close associate of the Duke's. And in the early morning, when the servants were still lighting the fires, he had made his way to the estate manager's office and removed 3 documents from the correspondence files. Documents Jonathan Bray had sent. Documents that detailed, in precise professional language, the financial instability of Watson Estate's land income and the restructuring that would be required to sustain it. Alexander had read these documents 3 weeks ago, the first time. He had recognized their value immediately, not as information to help the estate, but as leverage to use against the Duke if the Duke ever stopped being useful to him. Alexander Rahman was, in ways that the polished surface of him carefully concealed, a man who collected other people's vulnerabilities the way other men collected paintings. He sealed the documents in his personal case. He had not decided yet exactly how to use them, but Eva O'Donnell's wager had complicated his position. If she was going to have access to Watson's commercial operations, she would eventually find the discrepancy in the accounts that he had been quietly manipulating for 2 years. He needed to move faster. Meanwhile, at Briar Hall, the Duchess Margaret O'Donnell sat across from Eva in the library and looked at her niece for a long time without speaking. Then she said, Jonathan told me you knew about the estate documents." "He showed them to me in the spring," Eva said. "You asked him to." "I asked him to explain the general financial landscape of the county estates," the Duchess said carefully. "I did not specifically ask him to, Aunt Margaret." Eva held her aunt's gaze. "You knew something would happen at that estate. You have been preparing me for this for 3 years." The Duchess was quiet. Then, with the small, precise smile of a woman who has always played a longer game than the people watching her. "I knew that your intelligence deserved a larger room than I could give it. I suspected George Watson might eventually provide one. I did not anticipate that he would do it through public mockery and a shooting wager." "Life is rarely this obliging," Eva agreed. The Duchess reached across the desk and laid her hand over Eva's. Her grip was warm and firm. "What you did in that courtyard," she said, "is something I have been wanting someone to do for 30 years. I hope you know what you have started." Eva looked down at their joined hands. "I know what I want to build," she said. "I'm not yet certain I know all the obstacles." She did not know, in that moment, about Alexander Rahman. She did not know about Alex, whose full name was Alex Mercer, who was not an aristocrat and not a gentleman, but who had been doing business with Alexander Rahman under the table for 2 years, handling the movement of embezzled estate funds through a network of false merchant accounts. She did not know that her presence in Watson's commercial operations was going to disturb a nest that had been carefully, quietly built in the dark. She would find out soon enough. 3 days after the courtyard wager, Jonathan Bray arrived at Watson Estate for the formal legal meeting. He arrived at Briar Hall first, at Eva's invitation, and they sat in the library for 2 hours going over every document she had, every clause she intended to propose, every point of vulnerability in the estate's commercial structure. Jonathan had been Eva's informal legal tutor for 4 years. He was not given to extravagant expression, but as they worked through the documents that morning, he looked up twice. Once when she identified a land use clause that gave her broader operational authority than even he had seen, and once at the end when she set down her pen, and each time his expression was the same, a contained, a professional respect that said more than he would ever say aloud. "You understand," Jonathan said, as they prepared to leave, "that if this arrangement is legally formalized, you will be operating in a space that has no precedent for a woman of your position. Every man in that commercial network will test you. Some will test you politely. Some will not." "I understand," Eva said. "And you're certain you want this? Not the marriage? The business?" Eva looked out of the library window at the estate's kitchen garden, where Mabel was moving between the rows with a basket on her arm, unhurried, certain of every step. "The marriage would give me a title," Eva said. "The business will give me a voice. I know which one I can use." Jonathan nodded once and gathered his papers. That the meeting at Watson Estate was conducted in the Duke's study, a room that smelled of old wood and tobacco and the particular weight of accumulated property. George Watson sat across from Jonathan and Eva at the long oak table. His estate manager, Lucas, sat at his right, a solid, honest man who had spent 15 years trying to keep the estate profitable and who looked at Eva's proposed arrangement with the expression of a man who has just been offered a lifeline he is not sure he deserves. Alexander Rahman was not invited. George had not specifically excluded him, but he had not invited him, and Alexander had understood what that meant, and had said nothing, and had spent the entire duration of the meeting in the estate's east drawing room drinking tea he did not taste. The terms were negotiated over 4 hours. And at the end of those 4 hours, a document existed, signed, witnessed by Colonel Payne and Oliver Fisher, who had been asked to return for the purpose, that gave Eva O'Donnell formal commercial partnership authority over 50% of Watson Estate's trading operations for a period of 5 years. It was, Jonathan said afterward, walking to his carriage in the golden late afternoon light, the most unusual legal document he had produced in 30 years of practice. He looked quietly delighted. The reaction from the wider aristocracy arrived in a second wave, harder than the first. If the initial news had been scandalous, the formal legal documentation of the arrangement was something closer to seismic. 2 duchesses sent letters to Duchess Margaret, one furious, one fascinated, or 3 prominent gentlemen wrote to George Watson expressing their concern about the precedent. George read each letter once and set it on his desk and did not reply. He was preoccupied with something he could not quite name. He had spent the 3 days since the wager in a state of unsettled thought that he kept trying to dismiss as irritation and kept discovering on examination was not quite that. He had reviewed Eva's proposed terms before the legal meeting. He had expected them to be amateurish, the impulsive demands of someone who had won a momentary victory and not thought through the implications. They were not. They were precise, thorough, and in 2 places legally clever in ways that revealed a depth of preparation he had not anticipated. He thought about that. He thought about the way she had stood in the courtyard, of the stillness of her, the way she had held the pistol with actual knowledge. He thought about the easy contempt he had felt when he pointed at her and spoke. He did not like thinking about that. It was uncomfortable in the way that true things are uncomfortable when you have been comfortably wrong about them for a long time. Lucas came to him on the evening after the legal meeting and said, "She wants to review the textile accounts." "Let her," George said. Lucas blinked. "All of them?" "All of them." Eva found the discrepancy in the 4th account ledger. It was the morning of her 3rd working day at Watson Estate, which George had made available to her with an efficiency that she suspected was partly pride. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it without the appearance of obstruction, and partly the quiet, the dawning suspicion that something in his accounts was wrong, and he did not yet know where. She sat at the desk in the estate's commercial office, a room off the main corridor that smelled of dust and old ink, and had clearly been used more for storage than work for several years, with the ledgers spread before her and Jonathan's methodology notes in her own hand beside them. Lucas sat across from her. He had been assigned to work with her by George's direction, and he had arrived on the first morning with the slightly desperate energy of a man who has been managing a problem for too long alone, and is not sure whether to feel relieved or afraid at the prospect of help. "This routing account," Eva said, setting her finger on a line entry. "These figures for the March to June quarter. The textile shipment costs." Lucas leaned over to look. "But what about them? They're 23% higher than the equivalent quarter the previous year. The shipment volume didn't increase. The routes didn't change. The carrier's rates are standard." She looked at him directly. "Where did this money go?" Lucas was quiet for a moment. That said everything. "Mr. Rahman manages those accounts directly," he said, at last, in the flat voice of a man choosing honesty and not knowing what it will cost him. Eva sat back. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, thinking. Then, "How long?" "About 2 years," Lucas said. "I noticed a year ago. I raised it with the Duke. He trusted Mr. Rahman's explanation." "What was the explanation?" "Market fluctuation in the carrier contracts. Variable rate adjustments." Lucas looked at her with the tired eyes of a man who had known the explanation was false and had not had the standing or the evidence or the right kind of voice to push past it. Eva thought of Alexander Rahman in the courtyard, the way he had stepped forward to interrupt her business proposal, the smooth management of his tone. She thought of the documents Jonathan had mentioned being removed from the correspondence files. "I need everything," she said to Lucas. "Every account ledger, every correspondence file, every routing contract for the past 3 years. I need it on this desk by tomorrow morning." "That will mean going to Mr. Rahman's personal files," Lucas said. "Yes," Eva said. Lucas exhaled slowly. "He won't like that." "No," Eva agreed. "He won't." She went to George Watson that evening. As she had debated it for an hour, walking in the walled garden of the estate as the light went down, the gravel quiet under her feet, the air carrying the first edge of real winter cold. She debated it the way she debated every significant decision, systematically, setting out the variables, weighing the costs of each direction. She could pursue it herself, quietly, without involving George until she had more. But that would take time she might not have if Alexander was already moving. She could go to Jonathan first, but Jonathan was 3 hours away and she needed to act now. She went to George. She found him in the study at the back of the house, not at his desk, but standing at the window, looking out at the grounds in the growing dark. He turned when she came in. "I found something in the accounts," Eva said. She did not soften it or build toward it. "I believe Alexander Rahman has been redirecting estate funds for approximately 2 years. I need access to his correspondence files, and I need your authority to compel it." George was very still. She watched him absorb it, the way a man absorbs something he has known, somewhere beneath his comfortable assumptions, and has not let himself look at. "Show me," he said. She spread the ledgers on his desk. She walked him through it, each entry, each comparison, each gap between what was recorded and what the evidence of the actual transactions supported. George listened without interrupting. His face was controlled, but there was a tightening around his eyes that she recognized. Not anger at her, but anger at himself, at the trust he had extended without examination. When she finished, the study was very quiet. "Rahman has been my associate for 7 years, George said. "Yes," Eva said. "I'm sorry." He looked at her, a genuine look, the kind she had not expected from him. "You don't need to apologize for my poor judgment." "I'm not apologizing for it," Eva said. "I am sorry you're in this position. There's a difference." George Watson looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he called for Lucas. Alex Mercer arrived at Watson Estate the following afternoon. He had been summoned, or more accurately, he had sent a letter first, because Alexander Rahman had sent him a message the previous evening that read only, "She's looking at the accounts. Move now." Alex was a man of approximately 40, what with the nondescript appearance of someone who had spent many years being deliberately forgettable. He had no title, no estate, and a carefully cultivated network of minor merchants and transport agents who moved money through legitimate-seeming channels. He had been doing this for 11 years. He arrived at the servants' entrance, which told you something about his understanding of his own standing, and asked to see the Duke. He was shown to the front hall instead, where he found not only the Duke, but Eva O'Donnell and Jonathan Bray, who had been summoned urgently and had arrived at 9 that morning with the speed and quiet focus of a man who understood the gravity of what the express letter had described. Alex had a letter in his coat. He produced it with the controlled calm of a man who believes he holds a stronger hand. "Oh, I have in my possession," he said, "a series of private communications between the Duke of Watson and certain parties regarding the estate's financial restructuring last year. Communications that, if made public, would suggest a knowing misrepresentation of the estate's solvency to 3 county lenders." He looked at George with the flat confidence of someone who has rehearsed this. "I believe we can come to an arrangement." Jonathan Bray had read approximately 800 such bluffs in 30 years, and he identified this one in 3 seconds. He set down his tea. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you are currently standing in the presence of a sitting duke with legal counsel under the documented observation of an active fraud investigation, of which you are, as of this morning's preliminary evidence review, a named associate. Or the communications you are describing were obtained through a scheme that constitutes criminal conduct under at least 3 statutes I can cite from memory." He paused. "Would you like to continue, or would you prefer to cooperate?" Alex Mercer's controlled calm developed a small fracture. George Watson, who had spent the past 24 hours in the particular discomfort of a man reassessing how much of his confident life had been built on ground he had not actually examined, looked at Alex Mercer and said with a quiet clarity that had nothing theatrical in it, "Give Jonathan the letter. Give him everything else. And then you will tell me where Rahman is." Alex gave him the letter. He also gave him, over the following 2 hours in the company of Jonathan and Oliver Fisher, the full account of 2 years of diverted estate funds, and false carrier accounts, and the network of minor transactions through which Alexandra Rahman had been systematically taking from the estate that had trusted him. Alexander Rahman had left Watson Estate that morning. He had taken his personal correspondence and the 3 documents he had removed from the estate files. He did not take quite enough, it turned out, because Jonathan had already reconstructed the relevant portions from what remained. The legal process would take months, but the shape of it was already clear. Eva found George Watson that evening in the walled garden, the same garden where she had walked the evening before, deciding whether to trust him. He was sitting on the low stone bench near the old sundial, not particularly dressed for the cold, staring at the dead flower beds with the expression of a man who has recently had his understanding of several things significantly revised. She sat down beside him, not too close, and did not immediately speak. After a while, George said, 7 years. Yes, she said. I thought I knew people, he said. I thought that was one thing I was actually good at. Eva considered him. The arrogance that had been so effortless in the courtyard was quiet tonight. Not gone, she thought, but underneath something more honest. He was not performing. He was simply sitting with the weight of having been wrong about someone in a way that had real consequences. You're good at certainty, she said carefully. That's different from knowing people. Certainty is quicker. It's also less accurate. George looked at her. Was that a criticism? He said. No, it was an observation, Eva said. You can decide what to do with it. Something shifted in his expression, a very small thing, but she saw it, a kind of wry, reluctant acknowledgement of a point well made. You've been doing that since the courtyard, he said. Saying things that are true in ways I can't actually argue with. I find it's the most efficient approach, Eva said. There was a pause. The garden was very still. Miss O'Donnell, George said, and his voice had the careful quality of someone choosing words they mean to mean. I owe you more than a formal acknowledgement in a courtyard. I owe you an honest apology. What I said that afternoon was cruel and it was stupid, and it came from a part of me that I am not proud of. Eva looked at the dead flower beds for a moment. I accept that, she said. And I want you to know, what I built here, what we are building here, it is not revenge. I am not interested in revenge. I am interested in what is possible when the right people use the right resources well. George Watson was quiet for a moment. You could have had the estate, he said, if you'd accepted the proposal. I could have had half of what the estate is now, Eva said. I intend to help build what it becomes. That is worth considerably more. George Watson looked at Eva O'Donnell in the dark garden and felt, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, genuinely outclassed by another person. Not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that made him understand that he had been operating in a smaller version of the world than existed. It was an uncomfortable feeling. He suspected, with the new accuracy he was developing, that it was also a necessary one. The legal resolution of the Rahman affair took 4 months. In the formal accounting conducted by Jonathan Bray, assisted by a second solicitor brought from London for the purpose, the diverted funds amounted to a figure that, while serious, was not enough to destroy the estate. It had weakened it. Alexander Rahman had been careful enough to take only what he calculated the estate could survive losing, which told you something about the caliber of his cruelty. He had not wanted to kill the source. He had wanted it dependent. Alex Mercer cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced legal consequence. His network of accounts was dismantled. The carriers who had participated without full knowledge of the scheme were given the option to renegotiate their contracts. But Alexander Rahman was found, 2 months later, in Bath, where he had established himself in a comfortable house and was already in the early stages of attaching himself to a new, wealthy associate. The legal case followed him. His social standing, which had been his primary protection for 40 years, dissolved with remarkable speed once the documented evidence was circulated. The aristocracy, whatever its failings, had a deep and functional contempt for those who stole from within it. He was never prosecuted criminally. The Duke, on Jonathan's counsel and Eva's advice, chose a civil resolution, complete repayment, formal documentation of the fraud, and a permanent formal record that would follow Alexander Rahman through every future social and business interaction he attempted. This is more damaging to him than prison, Eva had said, or when she and George had discussed it. George had looked at her. How? Prison ends, she said. A reputation doesn't recover. George had agreed. Charlie Burrows, who had been young and foolish rather than malicious, came to Watson Estate 2 weeks after the scandal broke, visibly mortified. He was 22 and he had spent those 2 weeks understanding, for the first time, what it meant to perform cruelty for social approval. He asked to speak to Miss O'Donnell. Eva received him in the commercial office where she was working. He apologized. It was awkward and genuine and slightly too long. Eva accepted it without drama and told him she would hold it against him for precisely as long as it took him to demonstrate that he knew better. He looked surprised. She returned to her ledgers. He left and spent the following year making different choices. The first trading results under Eva's commercial management came in 6 months after the legal formalization. The textile routing contracts she had renegotiated, replacing 3 of the existing carrier arrangements with newer routes she had identified through a combination of Jonathan's legal contacts and her own research into the county trade records, produced a 14% improvement in net margin in the first quarter alone. Lucas, who had been in the habit of delivering financial reports with the slightly apologetic manner of a man bringing bad weather, delivered this one with undisguised relief. George Watson read the figures twice and looked up at Eva, who was sitting across the desk from him in the commercial office. It had been properly cleaned and refurnished by this point and was no longer dusty. 14%, he said. It should be higher by next quarter, Eva said. The northern route is still adjusting. Once it stabilizes, I expect 17. George set the report down. Where did you learn this? He said. Not suspiciously, with genuine curiosity. Jonathan's legal texts, your estate's historical records, my aunt's library, and 8 years of paying attention to things people assumed I wasn't paying attention to, Eva said. George was quiet for a moment. Then, I would like to apologize for being one of those people. I know, Eva said. That's it? I know? What would you prefer I say? A pause, and then, unexpected, quiet, genuine. George Watson smiled. Not the performed smile of the courtyard. A real one, slightly rueful, directed at nothing in particular. Eva noticed it. She filed it away with the other things she had noticed about George Watson over the past months. The directness of him when he was not performing for a crowd, the way he listened when he believed the information was serious, the absence of the easy cruelty once it had been held up to the light and found to be what it was. She noticed all of it. And she still did not want to marry him. Not because she disliked him. She had found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not dislike him at all, but because what she wanted, what she had always wanted, was to be genuinely known, not acquired, to be chosen for who she was, not offered to as a consequence of an obligation. George Watson was learning to respect her. Or that was true, and it was real, and it mattered, but respect was not the same as love. She knew the difference. Noah Gibson had been at the edges of this story for longer than Eva knew. He was Jonathan Bray's nephew, the son of Jonathan's younger sister, who had married a country physician from the south of England. Noah was 29, of medium height, with the kind of quiet, attentive face that people sometimes mistake for ordinary because it does not perform itself. He had trained as an architect, which suited him. He liked the discipline of building things that needed to be both beautiful and structurally sound, and he had no patience for decoration that served no purpose. He had met Eva briefly, twice, or at his uncle's house, once 3 years earlier, when he had come to help with some estate renovation plans Jonathan was consulting on, and once 14 months ago at a small dinner Jonathan had hosted. Both times they had talked at length. Both times Eva had gone home thinking about the conversation afterward, in the particular way you think about conversations that felt like more room than you expected. She had not thought about him as a prospect, because she had spent many years not thinking about anyone as a prospect. The practice of expecting and then absorbing rejection had, over time, produced in her a careful distance from hope of that particular kind. Noah had thought about her. He had thought about her with the specific, clear, the unhurried attention of a man who has seen something real in another person and is patient enough to wait for the right moment, not to pursue, but to simply be present and honest, and see what grew from that. He came to Briar Hall on a Tuesday in March, 6 months after the wager, with a set of renovation drawings for a proposed improvement to the Duchess's East Wing, which Jonathan had commissioned. He had come to present them to the Duchess. He found Eva in the library instead. She was at the desk with 3 ledgers and a cup of cold tea. She looked up when he came in, and for a moment the expression on her face went through something, a small, unguarded shift, before it settled back into the warm composure she habitually wore. "Mr. Gibson," she said. "Miss O'Donnell," he said. He looked at the ledgers. "Am I interrupting?" "The accounts will be here when you leave," she said. "Sit down." He sat. They talked for 3 hours, about the renovation plans briefly, and then about the Watson Estate commercial work, which he had heard about from Jonathan and was genuinely interested in, asking questions that were specific and intelligent. About architecture and trade law and how they were, at their core, both about the relationship between structure and use. About the autumn, which had been longer than usual and was now finally giving way to the kind of hard winter clarity that made the world look as if someone had cleaned the glass. When he left, he paused at the library door and said, "Miss O'Donnell, may I come again?" Eva looked at him. "Yes," she said. He came again the following Tuesday, and the one after that. By the 4th Tuesday, they were walking in the walled garden after the drawing review, the same garden where Eva had walked the night she decided to trust George Watson, the same bench where she had sat with George in the cold evening light, and Noah was talking about a bridge he had seen in Bristol that had been built 50 years earlier and was still perfect, and Eva was listening with the particular attention she gave to things she genuinely found interesting rather than things she was politely tolerating. She was not thinking about how she looked. She was not thinking about the narrowness of the world's measure of her body or her age or her marriageability. She was thinking about the bridge and about the way the evening light came over the garden wall, and about the feeling, strange and quiet and warm, of being in a conversation that felt like home. Noah stopped walking and looked at her. "Eva," he said, the first time he had used her given name, and it came out without the hesitation of social form, as naturally as breathing. "I want to say something, and I would like you to hear it completely before you respond." She stopped walking and looked at him. "I have thought about you since the first evening I met you at my uncle's house," he said. "Not because of what you have done, though what you have done is remarkable. Because of who you are when you are not doing anything particular. Because of the way you think, and the way you speak, and the way you look at things that interest you. I am not asking you anything yet. I only want you to know that I see you, or not who society decided you are. You." Eva stood in the garden in the winter light. She did not speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was very quiet and very clear. "I have spent a great deal of my life," she said, "being seen as a problem to solve, or a circumstance to manage, or simply not being seen at all." She paused. "You are the first person outside this garden wall who has said that, and meant it without wanting anything from it." "I want to know you better," Noah said. "That is what I want." "That," Eva said slowly, "I can give you." Summer came early that year. The Watson Estate commercial operations had, by June, produced a result that surprised the county, not the aristocrats, who are now watching the whole arrangement with the cautious fascination of people who have decided to wait and see before forming a final opinion, but the merchant class, the trade networks, the practical people who measured things by what they produced. The results were producing, and they were producing reliably. George Watson had changed in ways that were not dramatic, but were real and therefore more significant than the dramatic kind. He had developed the habit of questioning his first assessments, rather than building on them without examination. He had let Lucas genuinely lead on the ground-level management, which had improved both Lucas's confidence and the day-to-day quality of decisions. He had asked Jonathan Bray to review every significant contract before signing rather than after. Small things, but the kind of small things that, accumulated, alter the character of a life. He and Eva had developed a working relationship that was honest, efficient, and occasionally sharp in the way that things are between two intelligent people who know each other well enough to disagree without performance. There was respect in it, deep and earned, the kind that does not need politeness to survive. One afternoon in July, George came to the commercial office where Eva was reviewing the next quarter's routing projections, and he set a formal letter on her desk. She looked at it. It was addressed to a regional merchant association. It introduced Eva O'Donnell as a commercial partner of Watson Estate and requested her formal inclusion in the Autumn Trade Conference, an event that had never, in its 40-year history, included a woman. "What, you didn't tell me you were doing this?" Eva said. "No," George said. "Why not?" "Because you would have told me it wasn't necessary," he said. "And you would have been wrong. It is necessary. Not for the estate. For the record." Eva looked at the letter for a moment. "Thank you," she said. George nodded once and left. Noah had asked the Duchess formally for permission to court Eva in April. The Duchess had said, with the precision of a woman who has been waiting for the correct person to ask the correct question. "You may, but you should know that she will not be courted in the conventional manner. She makes her own assessments." "I know," Noah had said. "That's why I'm here." The Duchess had looked at him for a long, deliberate moment. Then she had smiled, a real smile, not the careful social one, and said, "Well, they're good." The courtship had been, as the Duchess predicted, unconventional. It consisted largely of walks and honest conversations, and the gradual, quiet building of a shared understanding of how each of them saw the world and what they believed a life should be built on. Noah had proposed in the walled garden on a Sunday evening in September. He had not made a speech about her beauty. He had made a clear, direct statement about who she was and why he wanted to spend the rest of his life in her company, and he had done it without drama or performance, the way he did everything, with the quality of a person who means what they say. Eva had said yes. She had said it the way she said most important things, simply, without ceremony, as a statement of a decision she had made with full awareness of what it meant. She had cried, a little, what afterward? Not from sadness, from the particular relief of being genuinely arrived at somewhere you have been moving toward for a long time without being certain it existed. The wedding was at Briar Hall in October, on a day when the estate grounds were at their full autumn colour, gold and copper and amber in the trees, the air sharp and bright. It was a small wedding. Eva had wanted that. Zara Parsons stood with her and was radiant in dark red, crying from the moment the procession started and making no attempt to conceal it. Jennifer arranged the flowers in the Briar Hall chapel with the concentrated attention she gave to everything Eva asked of her, and stood in the back of the pews and pressed her handkerchief to her eyes through the entire ceremony. Mabel sat in the second row in her best dress and watched the whole thing with a steady expression that went completely unsteady exactly twice, when Eva walked in, and when Noah said his vows. The Duchess sat in the front row, upright as ever, with the expression of a woman who has done something excellent and is privately very pleased about it. George Watson was at the wedding. He sat at the back, which he had asked to do, and which Eva had agreed to because she understood the particular shape of what he was carrying. The weight of being a man who had started this story in one kind of life and was now sitting at the edge of a different kind, still finding his footing. He watched Eva O'Donnell walk down the aisle of the chapel in a dress the colour of cream and gold, and with her hair pinned with small flowers, and her head perfectly level, and her eyes entirely on Noah Gibson, who stood waiting for her with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his good fortune, and is trying very hard not to make it obvious. George Watson sat at the back of the chapel and felt something settle in him, something that had been unsettled since the afternoon in the courtyard. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt. A recognition of what it cost and what it produced when you changed the quality of how you saw another person, of what you could become when the change was real. The ceremony was 20 minutes long. It was complete. Now, before we reach the final chapter of this story, I need to pause and ask you something directly. If you were Eva O'Donnell, mocked, publicly humiliated, and then offered the very thing that society told you to want, would you have taken the easier path, or would you have built the harder, truer one? Drop your answer in the comments. We genuinely read every single one. And if this story has moved you, if it has reminded you of something you believe about worth and dignity and what a woman deserves to build for herself, please subscribe and leave a like. It costs you nothing. It means everything to this channel. Now, let us finish this story the way it deserves to be finished. The years that followed were not without difficulty. Building is never without difficulty. But the quality of the difficulty was different from the kind Eva had known before. It was the difficulty of expansion, of stretching toward something larger rather than the difficulty of endurance. The Watson Estate commercial operations, under Eva's management and with George's full cooperation and Lucas's ground-level execution, became one of the most efficiently managed trading networks in the county. By the end of the 5-year arrangement, the estate had recovered entirely from the financial strain of the Rahman years and was generating reliable, growing revenue through the textile routes, a new agricultural output contract with 3 county cooperatives, and a small but profitable import arrangement that Eva had identified through her trade law contacts. The 5th-year review, conducted formally, as the original agreement required, with Jonathan Bray and Oliver Fisher present, concluded with a result that was clear. The arrangement had worked, better than anyone had formally predicted. The George Watson offered a renewal of the partnership. Eva accepted on revised terms with a broader scope of commercial authority and a formal investment structure that gave her stake and income, not merely authority. It was the kind of arrangement that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier, and was now simply a matter of legal drafting. George had said, at the close of the review meeting, "I want to say something formally, since the witnesses are here." Everyone looked at him. 5 years ago, he said, I stood in my courtyard and said something that was ignorant and unkind about a woman who was more capable than I had any basis for assuming otherwise. He looked at Eva directly. The wager I lost that afternoon did not just change my financial situation. It changed my judgment, my management of this estate, and my understanding of what kind of man I want to be. A pause. I am grateful for it. Eva met his gaze. So am I, she said. Noah and Eva built a house. They built it together, not metaphorically, but literally. Noah had designed it, and Eva had contributed specific requirements from the first draft, and they had argued with great mutual enjoyment about 3 of the structural decisions, and agreed on all of them eventually. It sat on land that the Duchess had given Eva as a wedding gift, a parcel of Briar Hall's outer fields, gently elevated with a view of the valley that on clear mornings made you stand at the window longer than you planned to. They called it Ashby House, for the Duchess's family name. Their daughter was born in the spring of the 3rd year, in the bedroom at the front of the house, with the good morning light. They named her Clara Margaret. Clara for no one in particular, Margaret for the Duchess. The Duchess came to meet her granddaughter, for that was effectively what she was, and sat in the chair by the bed and held the infant with the careful, deliberate tenderness of a woman who has always held precious things as if she knew their weight. She looked at Eva, who was propped against the pillows with the specific exhaustion and total satisfaction of a woman who has just done something enormous. "Well," the Duchess said. "Well," Eva agreed. "You have made something remarkable," the Duchess said. "More than one thing." "You helped," Eva said. "A little," said the Duchess. "The rest was entirely you. George Watson married the following year, a woman named Olivia Arnold, who had stood in the crowd at Watson Estate that October afternoon and watched everything with her eyes very wide. She was clever and sharp-tongued and unimpressed by George's title in exactly the way he had discovered he needed to be unimpressed by. They argued frequently and loved each other with the particular intensity of people who are both too stubborn to back down from anything less than genuine feeling. He became, in the years after, a better man than the one who had pointed his finger across a courtyard and laughed. Not perfectly better. He was still capable of arrogance in moments of comfort, and Eva told him so with the directness of a business partner who has no obligation to be gentle about it. But he worked at it. That was the part that mattered. Charlie Burroughs became, over time, someone worth knowing. He stopped performing cruelty for social standing. He found his own footing, slower than Eva's, smaller in its scope, but genuine in its direction. Jonathan Bray retired at 62 and wrote Eva a letter saying that she had been the most instructive client of his career and that he intended to recommend her to every intelligent woman he knew. She framed it. Lucas managed Watson Estate's ground operations with a quiet excellence that produced results good enough that 3 neighboring estates asked him to consult on their management practices. He did so, at a fair rate, with the accumulated competence of a man who had been doing his job well for 20 years and had finally been in conditions that allowed others to see it. For Mabel watched all of it from the Briar Hall kitchen garden and expressed no particular surprise at any of it. She had known what Eva was since the morning in the garden, when a 12-year-old girl with flour on her dress and numbers in her head had said, simply, "I want to learn." "Of course you do," Mabel had said then. She had never thought any differently since. And so, the wager that began with a pointed finger and a crowd that chose easy laughter ended, as all things end when they are handled with enough intelligence and enough time, in something much quieter and much larger than a courtyard. Eva O'Donnell didn't win by becoming a duchess. She did not win by proving that she deserved the world's narrow approval, or by reshaping herself into the form that a society built on other people's discomfort had always required of women it did not know how to categorize. She won by building something real, something that produced results, required intelligence, rewarded honesty, and grew. She won by refusing to accept as final the verdict of people who had not taken the trouble to know her. She won by being exactly who she was, thorough, composed, patient, precise, and formidably, quietly, undeniably capable, in a room full of people who had decided she was less. She won by loving and being loved by someone who came to her, not with an offer of rescue, but with the simple, open intention of seeing her clearly. The Duke who had laughed at her became her greatest professional ally and in time, her genuine friend. The society that had whispered behind fans and smirked became, over years and results, quietly, grudgingly, and eventually genuinely admiring. Her daughter grew up in a house built on her parents' particular understanding that worth is not assigned by the room you are standing in, that love is not a transaction, that intelligence is not diminished by the body that carries it. And Eva O'Donnell, businesswoman, partner, wife, mother, niece of a duchess, student of Mabel's patience and Jonathan's precision and the walled garden's slow certainties, continued, for the rest of her long and well-lived life, to be exactly who she had always been, undeniable, because the greatest victory has never been being chosen. It has always been the clarity to choose yourself. This has been the story of Eva O'Donnell. If it moved you, if it angered you or inspired you or made you think about something you have been carrying, leave a comment and tell us. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what this story meant to you, and tell us, at which moment did Eva earn your complete respect? Subscribe to this channel and join us for the next story, because every episode we bring is a story that the history books left out. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next one.